Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are listening from, and welcome to 1% Better, where we take a look at hidden stories in sport. I'm Zalen Vanek, and I'm joined as always by Dr. David Lipman. Your medical question today is: what's currently considered the most likely primary cause of exercise associated muscle cramps? Is it dehydration slash electrolytes
We've
or
had this question before,
neuromuscular
mate.
fatigue?
We've had this question before.
Testing you, testing you. What's the answer?
Lazy, mate. Lazy is what it is. So the actual research suggests it's what we call a cramp recipe. So I can't remember the guy's name, Kevin something, out of the US somewhere. My apologies, but uh, the thinking is kind of they're always multifactorial with maybe bigger levers in some people. So historically, the electrolyte hypothesis has come from uh, like hot underground mines, and they end up with dehydration. They gave them salt and sort of helped them, but there's certainly in athletes. A lot of the time, it looks to be a neuromuscular fatigue component. I think in you, who's experienced quite a few, so listeners may not remember when you're an athlete, or may not know you're an athlete, but you certainly were and used to get cramping, particularly in the swim or just after the swim. And that says to me that there's no fatigue, there's no sweating, there's no anything like that. So it's probably more stress related in you in that context.
Interesting.
So it's probably always multifactorial with bigger um, components that play a role in certain individuals. And so if someone says, "Oh yeah, but all I did was take electrolytes and it helped," like true, there's probably two or three other things going on. But now that you've addressed that electrolyte issue, which may have been your biggest lever, then we've lowered the threshold and you don't cramp. So that's kind of how my read on the situation is. And it's been a little while since I've read the literature on it, but I think that's still the current understanding.
That's so interesting. So call me lazy for having this question, but that is an interesting answer, and I think people find a lot of
Well,
value in it.
only if it's not the same answer as I gave last time.
I wonder. I wonder. I have to go find it and listen back. This is the holiday season, so we sort of banked a few episodes to give listeners some insight into what's happening here, so we can have a bit of a break over the holiday periods. And happy holidays to everyone listening. Hoping you are having a wonderful time with family and friends. Before we get into some really, really interesting interviews we did over the next few weeks, the first one coming up in this episode is with Marco Altini, who we teased for about a year on this podcast, and he's
Yeah.
finally on. Before we get to Marco, though, we need to give a few shout outs to our partners who've supported us for most of this year. The first being Precision Fuel and Hydration. Obviously, if you follow triathlon, you've seen them just about everywhere this year. Unbelievable company that's just growing from strength to strength as it pertains to nutrition. And they've given you a 15% discount code off your first purchase for our podcast. We have a unique code. That discount code is 1PB2025. That's the number 1PB2025. We also have a direct link in the show notes down below that'll apply that discount code. So check them out. Who else do we need to give a shout out to?
Yeah, we need to shout out Stride. So Stride Running Power Meters. Really appreciate their support this year. They've been super helpful to us. I've been using the Stride Pods for quite a while. They had a Black Friday sale. Hopefully, some of you took advantage of it. Hopefully, use the code for that. We would appreciate you following the code in our show notes, the link in our show notes, so that we can, just be attributed that we're driving visitors to them. Obviously, for us, these partners look at us to try and help for whatever reason. So in Precision, obviously, they're looking to try and help you guys buy some product. Stride are looking for awareness. So we love if you go check them out. It helps us a lot. I use Stride metrics all the time in my running. We've talked about it ad nauseum on previous episodes. So we don't want to begrudge or we don't want to burden the points here with all these partners, particularly at this time of year. We tend to try and make these things informative so that you sort of don't mind hearing from them. Obviously, given Xylan's need for time off, we're doing a slightly different thing for these 3 episodes. So we appreciate you all listening in. We think the episodes are going to be some of our more popular ones, ironically, with less of us, but they are going to be great. So we appreciate them. And then the last sponsor we have to give a shout out to is Core. So obviously Core, we've been working with the last quarter of the year. Their body temperature sensors. I've been using, again, one for probably 2 years now, maybe more. You'd notice them on a lot of heart rate belts floating around the Peloton and in triathlon particularly. They're pretty common. Had a lot of heat content recently around heat training and that sort of stuff as a result. of the core sponsorship there. We've also had some of their athletes on, so we've had Dan Jones on and a few others as well. So really appreciate them making those athletes available to us and doing all those things. So we really appreciate Core's support this year, and so please go check them out as well. Again, follow the link in our show notes. It does help them know that it's coming from us.
All these sponsors are only possible thanks to you, thanks to every single person that has subscribed or listened to an episode. So we really just like to take this time to say thank you to and really appreciate. And also ask you, if you haven't done so yet, please subscribe to the podcast or rate the podcast. Right, should we get to our chat with Marco Altini, with your
Yep, sounds
mate?
great.
Dr. Marco Altini is an entrepreneur, data scientist, endurance coach, and runner. He is the founder and head of product at HRV for Training, a tool that is today trusted by more than 200,000 users, including Olympic medalists, professional teams, and the hosts of this podcast. Additionally, Marco is a data science advisor to Oura and a guest lecturer at Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. Marco completed his MSc cum laude in computer science engineering from the University of Bologna. Following this, he went on to complete his PhD cum laude in machine learning from Eindhoven University of Technology. He then went back to university to complete his MSc cum laude in human movement science high performance coaching from Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Marco has 15 plus years of experience modeling physiological data for health and performance, including 50 plus publications at the intersection between technology, health, and performance. As part of his consulting work, he worked with Oura on the development of the next generation sleep staging algorithm and with Strava on their relative effort algorithm. Having been self coached for the majority of his running career, Marco has run a marathon in 2:56. He's run a 50K in 3:43 and 9:25 at 100K del Passatore, where he came 67th. Recently, he started coaching other athletes at Destination Unknown Coaching. If all of this wasn't enough, Marco writes an excellent newsletter covering a variety of topics in training and HRV, and has recently opened The Lab in Brisighella, where he has a full metabolic cart. Marco is godfather to Paulinho the puppy, a part-time van lifer, recent addition to Team Trail Running Poles, and honorary head of tourism for Brisighella. Marco, we've been teasing you on this podcast for about a year. You have finally arrived. People get to meet the Marco Altini. Welcome.
Here I am. That's right. Thank you, Tim.
We appreciate you joining us, Marco. It's been a long time coming. You're a personal friend of mine, and I don't like to call those favors in often, but you're kind enough to say yes. So thank you very much for joining us. It is a true honor, and excited to talk to you about lots of things. Maybe
Same
let's
here.
start with what you're most known for. And can you explain HRV in brief to us?
Yeah, so HRV or heart rate variability is, in very short, a proxy of stress. So it's an indirect way to measure our stress response. And that's why we find it a useful marker. We cannot really measure stress, or we cannot really measure even our stress response in other non-invasive ways at a frequency that would make sense, right? We could look at hormones in certain ways, but that is not easy. We cannot do it every day, and then it's complex to make that data actionable. Heart rate variability also gives us insights into how the body responds to stress, but it's something that we can measure easily with technology that today almost all of us have at our disposal. And that is basically what it is and why we think it's an interesting marker.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here. You said it's a proxy for stress, so we can check our stress throughout the day using HRV. Is that fair to say, or not really?
That's my favorite application, right? There's a
Yes, it is.
We need
I
to
know the
elaborate
questions to
here.
ask to mess with you.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, for the listeners. So, well, let's say that HRV becomes a proxy of stress when we measure it under certain circumstances. That is really important because HRV, technically speaking, simply refers to the variability in heartbeats, right? So if we want to make it more practical, let's say that we look at when the heart is beating over a few minutes, and if we capture the exact time between consecutive beats over, again, a minute or 2 minutes, and then we look at the variability of this data because the heart does not beat at a constant frequency, then we compute the variability, and that is HRV. However, the stress response is not the only thing that will impact our heart rate variability. All sorts of things do during the day. Some things are relevant. It is sometimes part of the stress response, but there's also all sorts of other things. It could be an abnormality in heart rhythm that makes HRV not relevant when we compute it. For example, ectopic beats, premature ventricular contraction, any sort of things, any sort of arrhythmias, for example, those would make the data not relevant anymore in the context of a stress response. But even other things like drinking water could have an acute impact on even on our blood plasma volume, and that could change a bit the way that HRV is measured, and that would also not be linked anymore to our stress response. Similarly, if we are talking, or if we are swallowing saliva, or if we are yawning, or any sort of thing that we might be doing can impact heart rhythm in a way that then when we measure it, it does not represent anymore our stress response. It could be linked to a confounding factor, one of these things we mentioned. It could be simply something that then basically loses its meaning because it's not anymore this clear association between the body stress response and the parasympathetic nervous system and our cardiac variability, but it's just cardiac variability, not linked again to the stress response. So if we look at it at random points throughout the day or after any sort of confounding factor, then we lose the capacity to basically take this measurement and associate it to our stress response. In order to be able to do that, then we need to measure at certain times, and that is typically not continuously during the day.
I guess so. Let's stop bearing the lead here, Marco. You have HRV for training. It's an app. You advocate for morning HRV measures. What are our other options, right? So if I don't want to measure in the morning because I have children or something like this that ruins my morning, um, what are my other options?
Yeah, so given the confounders that we mentioned and the fact that, again, during the day, all sort of things impact our physiology in ways that HRV is not necessarily representative of the nervous system response, we end up having two ways of measuring HRV that are well established and useful in the context of capturing our stress response and also in making the data actionable. And that is the morning, as you mentioned, that is typically what I would recommend for a number of reasons we can get into later. Or the other option is the night, of course. That is what wearables do, so that you can get the data as you sleep. So these two options are both valid ways to capture your data as you are in a resting state asleep, and you're also measuring in a consistent context, typically more or less the same way every day, through the night or first thing in the morning. And then you're also typically measuring quite far from stressors. That is also the other important aspect. So a bit far from confounding factors, but also to give enough time to the body to recover from the previous stressors. So these two ways, the night or the morning, can be good ways to capture data with some differences.
Yeah, so listeners listening to this are probably going, well, hang on a second, why would I want to move it away from stresses? And my take here is that there are acute stresses that are transient. For instance, that text message, email, or Instagram reel that annoyed you. And then there are more chronic stresses, which is what we're trying to capture here. What we're really trying to understand is the body's ability to tolerate stress. But as a proxy, well, we're using how stressed you are as a proxy to tolerate more stress, roughly. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's right. So if we measure very close to an acute stressor, first of all, it's perfectly normal to have a stress response in which your body is stressed, right? So HRV is very low and maybe heart rate is higher and all of that. So, there is no need to be concerned about that, right? Because that is something that happens, unfortunately, with wearables and stress checks and stress monitors and those sort of things, that people think that they should not be stressed because stress is bad. And of course, we know that's not the case, right? We need stress for growth. At the same time, we don't want that stress to become chronic, and that is why we look at these parameters only at certain times, for example, the night or first thing in the morning, because as more important stressors impact your body, the acute ones, they can actually be quite strong, that they would show up in the data for 24, 48 hours. That could be a hard training, it could be that maybe you're getting a bit sick. Any sort of thing that has a meaningful impact on your physiology acutely still will last enough that you don't need to check on it every 30 seconds, but you can measure at these known times, and you would get still a meaningful data point representative of your stress response. And then more chronic stressors, those will impact your physiology more slowly. Like, could be psychological stressors, maybe something at work is stressing you out, could be still our health, or it can also be training in a way that it's not just the acute workout, but we are building up more load and maybe we are not responding so well, and chronically we see the impact in the data. So all sort of acute and chronic stressors that we want to capture are the ones that have a meaningful impact on our physiology for at least a day or two. While the small things, like as you said, you watch something online on your phone, or you're having coffee, all of these things, those are confounders for the data. It means that if you measure your HRV after having coffee, it's suppressed, but you should not change your day based on that point, right? It's not actionable anymore. It's not representative of your physiological response to the previous days of stress, to the overall load you're putting on your body. It is just what happened a minute ago, and that becomes irrelevant. So that's why we need good protocols.
Yeah, and back to the two measurement types, I guess, or the two options for measurement: overnight average versus a morning measurement of somewhere between 1 and 10 minutes, depending on how relaxed your morning is. What are the pros and cons of them, would you say? Because this is something I know you've done a lot of work on. When we were talking probably 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago now, I was like, hey, Marco, if they're the same, build an algorithm to connect them for people. We've had lots of discourse around this, and I think both of our views have changed here a little bit. So, yeah, I'd love to hear your takes on pros and cons of them.
Yeah, so I'll start with the main differences, which I think are due to two aspects. One is the body position, which of course can be a factor only for the morning measurement because we are lying down when we sleep. So there we are only measuring in that body position, while in the morning we could measure sitting up or standing up. And there is at this point a good amount of research that shows that if you measure after changing body position, so for example in the morning you sit up, and then after a short period, say 15 seconds, you take your measurement, or you stand up and similarly you take your measurement. This is called the orthostatic stressor. You are just you change body position, your body needs to readjust, right? Blood volume is moving, and you basically stress the body a little bit, and measuring in that context makes the data more sensitive to stress and eventually more useful. For example, a recent study that looked at changes in resting physiology when athletes went to an altitude camp showed that in their night data, they could not even see that they were at altitude. So the data was the same as at sea level. But when they were measuring in the morning after standing up, it was clear that there was a change. And then through that change, you can also measure adaptation as the days and the weeks go by and people get used to being at altitude. So the data is more sensitive captured that way if you use, a different body position. So that is the one factor I would advocate typically for athletes to do it in the morning.
Can I ask a technical question? And forgive me if you've answered this already. You're going to have to explain things to me very slowly. I'm a very simple person. But the wearables that measure throughout the night, do they take multiple data points throughout the night? And how does that vary versus using an app in the morning to take a reading in the morning?
Yeah, so that's a great question because it addresses, I think, the other side of it. So one is body position, and the other one is basically when we are measuring, and also, in a way, how much data is available at that point. So to answer your question, when you look at the data from the night, typically the data is computed every 5 minutes, and then you have all these data points throughout the night, and typically an average is taken. Sometime they could give a bit more weight to certain parts of the night. Some wearables do that, others just give you an average. At the end of the day, it's extremely similar because there is a lot of data and still it pulls towards the average, so it does really change much. Now, the main point there, I think, is that obviously the night comes before the morning, so it's just a different time. And typically that means that you are measuring closer to the stressors of the previous day, right? So in the morning, you are measuring after the restorative effect of sleep, which I think is also nice because, we always think of stressors in a negative way. There's also positive stress in a way that is, you sleep and there is this phase of restoration. And you can take that also as something that is happening and you measure after that happened as opposed to during it. So in a way, it is also different from that point of view. Then, if you are having a late dinner or if you drank some alcohol or if you worked out in the evening, all of these situations make it so that night data is more tightly coupled to the stressor just because it's earlier. It could be that in the morning, then everything is back to normal, right? It wasn't such a big deal. But if it happens just before you start measuring because you're going to sleep soon after what happened, after the stressor, then that will have an impact. So in general, what happens here is that night data tends to be more reflective of your behavior, what you did before. And some people find it very useful for that, right? Because they see that their behavior had an impact on the data. So it's not a negative in the context of using the data for the individual, because still you learn something from it. But at the same time, when you collected it that way, I think it is less actionable for the day ahead. So in that context, the morning data might be more actionable because again, it's less coupled to your previous behavior. You gave more time for the body to renormalize, and you will measure your actual stress response again after the restorative effect of sleep. And that means that at that point, what you measure, I think, reflects better your ability to assimilate stress on that day, which is the principle behind using HRV, for example, to guide training. And from that angle, then the morning data would become more useful. But again, it depends a bit. What's your interest, I would say, if you want to maybe fine tune your behavior, if you want to see the impact of your behavior or your resting physiology, or if you want to use the resting physiology to guide your training, then maybe the two protocols have slightly different advantages. And to answer also Dave's question at the beginning, I think the pros and cons, of course, the pros of using a wearable is that you don't have to actively measure, right? So that is great because you passively measure, and in a way it's easier for many people. At the same time, of course, you need to buy a device, wear a device in the night. So some people might like that or might not like that. You most likely need to pay a subscription these days, which also some people might like or not like. But at the same time, it is certainly convenient. So in many settings, I think also working with athletes, like if I work on an individual basis, it's very easy. Like some athletes might use an app in the morning and some might not, and it's totally fine. But if you work in a team, for example, and you want everybody to do the same, becomes maybe harder to get that consistent data. So you might go for the wearables because possibly you collect all the data. You don't have, to hope that everybody behaves the same, which is unlikely to happen. Even though I've heard many stories from, professional teams and athletes pretending to lose wearables and things like that. So it's not so simple.
Yeah, well, team sport athletes are not endurance athletes. Having worked with both, I can tell you the personality types are very different. So nothing would surprise me from a team sport athlete losing wearables, putting them on somebody else, putting them on on toes, not fingers, whatever. Anything could happen with a team sport athlete. Nothing would surprise me. Let's
Having said that, and I don't want to put you guys on the spot here by talking about brands, one thing that has surprised me is, let's say, cricket, for an example. It's a team sport. The amount of athletes wearing whoops, and I mean, they go out to bat with their whoop on one ball, and that thing can be destroyed, But they're obviously so intent on collecting the data, while and probably they're more interested in while they're batting, especially, which is the only reason I can think is why they wear it. But there's an example which surprised me. I'm of the same opinion as you, Dave. Like an endurance athlete versus a team sport athlete, these are two different animals we're dealing with here. So I'm very surprised at the amount of cricketers in a sport like team wearing that wearable. But also maybe it's a cultural thing, or maybe it's an influence thing. Everyone else sees everyone else wearing it, so it must have value. So I have to do this. I don't want to miss the boat, etc.
So I was telling Marco off air before I chatted to. When this is released, we will have talked about this paper already. So you can go back and listen to that episode. But we have not recorded that episode yet, Zylan. I was talking to a mutual colleague of Marco and I, Peter Duking, very good researcher out of Germany. And he just released a paper at the time of recording this, looking at use of data from coaches. And almost all coaches, and this was a mix of team and endurance sports, you collected wearable data, and almost none of them did much with it. Is what he told me at a high level. I haven't read the paper yet, but the point I'm making there, he said, so I don't know why they use it, and I said placebo effect is part of it, is buy-in and those sort of things. When it comes to Whoop, I strongly suggest that those athletes are probably self-buying the devices and paying their own subscriptions, and the team may or may not have access to that data. So that's very different to a team issue of whatever, whether it's Whoop, Oura, Apple Watch, Garmin, all these things collect data, right? Using Marco's app, for instance. And all of them, for the most part, maybe not Garmin and Apple Watch, have the ability for you to see that data as a sports science manager or whatever. The question is, do you know what to do with it? Do you have the resources to even track it and adjust training with it? Or do you have to rely on the athletes, right? And so there are two ways to go about that is we own this, we're giving it to you, this is part of a centralized pattern, or you're your own athlete, you have to dictate your own things, you go buy your own wearables and do your own thing, right? The reason they're all wearing their Whoop is because it has meaningful data that it captures for its experience called strain, and you'd want that during batting and bowling and catching and playing, right? You'd want all that stuff, right? So Oura collects similar data, but it's less of a hero feature for them, so people don't wear their Oura rings during the day for a lot of people. So I don't know if you have any other takes on that, Marco, but that's my take on this.
Yeah, I think so. I think many people, in a way, might be even just afraid of missing out. Right? You see that other athletes have these devices, and they also wear this device. I'm not surprised from the study you mentioned that there's so many wearables out there and so little data is used for actionability. I wouldn't be surprised at all. I think even when it is used in some ways to talk about the data and not just show the device, often it's really the most obvious things, and I was sick, or I drank too much alcohol, and it's like really the most obvious things that you don't need a wearable for. So I think there's a lot of room there for using that data more effectively and to learn more from that data. But yeah, I think it's a bit of a work in progress, and some companies like Whoop, I think, did much better at marketing to athletes, right? So that's why lots of athletes have these devices. Like it has been their target user for so long. Other companies maybe tried a slightly different market, or has been more for the well-being and general health and sort of things. So seen less as a device for an athlete, maybe to a certain point, even though in terms of the night data they capture, it's basically the same thing. So like normally from my perspective, it's more a matter of fun factor and what a person likes, right? The data you get, that's the data that you can capture with an optical sensor, and it's very similar things. So depending on the preference of the individual, you want to wear a band or you want to wear a ring. I think both devices at this point provide very similar data points in terms of assessing your stress response or even sleep patterns and the few other things that are sort of okayish.
Marco, can I ask you a personal question? And you don't have to answer it if you don't like the question.
Go
But
ahead.
I think your point is Your point is valid. I think Whoop have marketed to athletes and high level athletes, and they run the risk of alienating the everyday person when they try to reach that market because it can maybe be perceived as an elite high performance tool. Aura, on the other hand, seems to be going for example, in South Africa, Aura is partnering with my medical insurance company here, where you can next year get the device through your plan and you earn points towards your reward system, blah, blah, blah. So that's to the everyday person. With HRV for training, like, you are a small team, but you have such a great product. Like, how do you think in terms of trying to go up against these giants and get more people to use your product? I mean, we said in the intro there you have over 200,000 users, which I think is incredible. And I'd like to know how you did that. I know you're very modest, which is strange for an Italian, but I'd love to know how you did that.
So I would say that in general, I mean, I've never seen it as competition, meaning that it's just a different kind of animal, right? So both in terms of the company and the product also, right? When you build hardware, it's just a different thing. Like you need a lot of money, you need a lot of funding, and then the whole trajectory you take is also has to be linked more, to growing and, making your investors happy and trying to keep the whole thing going and growing, because otherwise, yeah, it's just not gonna pay off in the long run. So I think they are kind of forced to play this game in a way. That was never my game. I'm more of a scientist, and then I love to build things, but the rest, I think I was just lucky. I was very lucky that I built this in a different time. It was like 12, 13 years ago. First iPhones, first sensors that you could link to a phone. Like now, they would not be the same, right? The market is very saturated with many different things, millions of apps. I think it was the right time. And then I built the product, keeping it in its niche, doing what I thought was useful. And at the same time, there was interest. People were talking about it. Again, there wasn't really anything else or very few other apps and things like that. So word of mouth is how we grew. And then again, as a scientist, I always cared a lot about the validation of the work. So showing that, for example, when we said we could measure HRV with the phone camera instead of using a chest strap, then to show that that was the case, and publish papers showing that that was the case, and then using the data also to show that you could capture different stressors in a way that it would reflect what you were doing, the intensity of your training and things like that. So to put some evidence behind the work. And that turned into, the niche and something that stayed niche but was pretty solid also for maybe sports organizations or universities and things like that are many of our clients. And of course, it's more accessible in a way. It's just an app. It's cheaper. You pay it only once. I mean, it's an expensive app, so to speak, right? Because people are used also to free apps. While we never went there, we decided, okay, we do this work and we think that the work should be paid for, but then it's just, one fee, €10, and that is it. And you have access, forever. So that I think people appreciate. That's maybe now more than before, right? Before we got, a lot of critics because it was not a free app and you had to pay this €10. But now we are still €10 and everything else is a subscription. So in a way, now they appreciate it more. And of course, I get a lot of questions, a lot of pressure in a way to put it as a subscription, but it's just not what we want to do or who we are in a way. So we keep it that way. And being a glass half full, definitely kind of person, I know that our days are, somehow counted. We cannot just, we will not last forever. And the approach is, it's difficult these days with so many different solutions and HRV being embedded, sort of wearables. But we keep doing the work that we think is valid and can help individuals that maybe, again, for different reasons, still prefer to take their measurements and to do their things. That's why also we didn't integrate so much with wearables. And at the beginning a little, but then we sort of stopped because I thought, okay, this is not what we want to do, right? We don't want to be a platform where you get your wearables data. It's a bit of a different thing if you want to use HRV, if you want to just, limit the scope of what you do to this specific signal and to how to interpret it properly. So again, really being true to the niche in a way instead of trying to do everything. And that, people still come to us. So in a way, it's still working out. But yeah, it's complicated. The market evolves and technologies change. And at this time, I think we still have a product that gives you something different in the way that you see it. For example, when we're talking before about the studies, the morning measurements, the changing body position, how you could capture stressors like altitude that is not necessarily present in wearables data. There are differences, and of course, you need to be motivated to look into these kind of things and to think that's useful to you. But it's not, the passive measurement and let's see what happens. But still, that's a bit how we've played it and how I see it, at least.
So I'm going to say a couple of things here because I'm kind of in the industry and Marco's a bit too modest and a bit too nice to say some of these things. €10 a steal for an app you pay for once. It's not it's a single cost. The other thing is you take it from phone to phone. It makes a ton of sense in that respect. But also, like if you think about our context, Zylan, you and I, working on a project, Team Amani, we have a bunch of people. All of them have phones. And we could easily then get them all, for a single cost of whatever, however many thousand athletes we want, it's a single cost for us to insert that. And then, of course, we have a subscription for the back end, the dashboard as a coaching team. But that's much more sustainable as a business model for us than buying them all wearables or getting wearables. Now, if there's a sponsor that comes along, discussion's different, sure. But if you think about it like that, it makes a ton of sense when you've got Real Madrid, right, who've got 10,000 junior athletes. They can just, all right, we're just going to buy you all this app, right? It's much easier for them. And then you have a standardized protocol, standardized data at the back end, all those things. You don't have parents complaining about whatever. No one loses anything, as you say. Like these kids are never going to lose a phone. It's not going to happen, right? They don't lose phones. They lose everything else. So I think you're right, Marco. Some of it, despite how good the product is, some of it is timing, and some of it is the market shift that has been, shone on you brightly in a positive way. But I do think what you build is great. I often text you about how what you've built is so much better than many others in terms of things like prediction of times, these sort of things. Like, I think you've built some really good stuff on top of it for pro users, right? That the baseline users may not have seen, but your lactate threshold estimation, these sort of things, you built really, really good tools there. So I would commend you on that. And you've also built a bunch of stuff around it for fun that people can get, right? Like you've done all sorts of other stuff around it that I think it helps build the brand and helps build people's affinity for you, right? They'll buy your app because they want to support you, which I think is great as well. So
I appreciate it.
let's talk a bit more about the postural stuff. Oh, you're welcome, mate. Let's talk a bit more about the postural stuff because I find the postural stuff really interesting. So for users to understand, when you stand up, your body needs to use stress hormones, right? You go from sitting down, you have to stand up. And if we don't get blood to your head, you will swiftly lie back down involuntarily, right?
Yes.
You will fall down and it's a problem. So as you stand up, your body needs to respond pretty quickly. And people who don't, who get lightheaded when they stand up, this is exactly that, right? This is exactly what they struggle with. So what happens is you get a squirt of some stress hormones. This spikes your blood pressure a little bit, spikes your heart rate. All those things allow you to get blood to your brain because it doesn't take much pressure to get blood to the brain when it's sitting at the same level as the heart. It's horizontal. There's no gravity. When you stand up, there's a ton of gravity, right? So this all makes sense. What Marco's talking about there is either sitting up or standing up, which are different degrees of the same problem. You then have a mild stress response, which uncovers some baseline level stress, which is otherwise masked because of the, I guess, chronic adaptation to endurance training. Is that fair to say, Marco? Because what I'm trying to capture is that why is it so hidden when we're lying down as endurance athletes? Because that doesn't really happen in team sports.
Yeah, exactly. I think the issue is more obvious for endurance athletes that have maybe particularly low heart rate. HRV is already, I mean, I wouldn't say high, but maybe a bit above the general population. If you have these kind of values, your training volume is high, and maybe your blood plasma volume also might be higher, and there's all sort of changes in your physiology that then make the measurement yeah, somewhat less sensitive to subtle stressors. So if you're sick, you're still gonna sit. But then I would say even then, sometimes not to the same extent. I collected data on myself, for example, even so, where I had basically not not proper sickness, but I had a night in which I wasn't well, right? And maybe with you have a bit of fever, and it could be maybe something you ate, or you don't develop a proper flu or anything like that. It's just a 24 hours thing. So if at that time I was measuring both in the morning and in the night, and then looking at the night data, it was very obvious that that night, even just looking at heart rate, we keep it very simple. Let's look at heart rate instead of the variability of it. The heart rate was much higher that night. And the same thing was in the morning, even though in the morning after sitting up, then again, the response is amplified. So if in the night my heart rate was maybe 60 instead of 50, in the morning was 75, because again, you sit up and then there is a much larger change, and the body is much slower at doing those readjustments when you are sick or when there is more stress simply already on the body. Then the following day, when I was fine, night data is back to normal. So it's again 50 beats per minute during the night. I am asleep. It's a highly parasympathetic state. Basically, you cannot detect that stress. But then I sit up in the morning and my heart rate is still above 60. So it's much lower than the previous day, but still way higher than my normal heart rate in the morning. And again, sitting up basically again amplified that stressor that was still there because I wasn't well 24 hours before, but in the night data I couldn't see it. So I think this is quite common, and it is why the change in posture makes it useful, and why it has been used, I would say, for decades in research. What they do in the lab is actually they make it so that you don't even have to do it yourself, right? They put you in that tilt table, right? So a table that basically changes body position, and then they measure how your physiology changes as you go through this change, from lying down to basically standing on the table. And that's something that has been studied as a way to capture your response, because you stress the body and you change the position. And that is what we can replicate in simpler ways in the morning. Normally, I recommend sitting because, as you said, sitting and standing is the same thing, but a different degree of that stressor. And then sitting, I think it's much easier and much easier not to mess up. Standing sometimes is a bit much, maybe, as a stressor. And then it's also more difficult to standardize, maybe, because then being larger the stressor, then the time you wait before you measure also needs to be more standardized, because otherwise it has a greater impact if you wait 10 seconds or 30 seconds. It could be quite a bit different. So I think we add too much complexity into something that should be rather simple. So in the morning, if we just sit up, wait a few seconds and measure, typically that's very simple and consistent, and that's what I would recommend as a practical protocol.
And knowing a lot of your writing, because I read your newsletter religiously, which we have a link to in the show notes, and I would encourage people to go read it with respect to a lot of these questions. If you have questions, I guarantee you Marco's answered it in a newsletter, or in his Substack. But one of the things is go to the toilet first. If you need to go to the toilet, go to the toilet before you measure. I know that's something you advocate regularly. I've got a question for you here, Marco. What's the goal? What's good HRV? Is it high? Is it stable? Is it both? What's the story here?
As high as possible. That's what I hear on social media.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think that this is really something that we need to see a bit differently, but that people can really relate to easily if we think about how we look at many other signals. So if we look at our blood pressure, our blood glucose, any sort of thing, even other biomarkers, typically we consider that they have an optimal range. And when it's above or below that, we know that maybe we need to pay attention and see if there is something that maybe is not going in the right direction. And HRV, I think we should see it more that way, where we have this optimal range and where we want data to be within that. So, in a way, stable. And then if it's below the normal range or above it, typically it means that something is a bit of an abnormality, even just statistically, apart from the link to the stress response, and then that is something that we need to pay more attention to. The difficulty, I think, here is that for the other signals I mentioned, typically we have a normal range that is the same for everyone, so to speak. We have population level normal ranges, and we could argue that maybe should not be the case for everything, but still we do have what's a normal blood pressure is, what a normal blood glucose is, and so on. For HRV, we don't have that. So the only way to know your normal range is for yourself to measure, and to measure for several weeks so that you can establish what is your normal range. Because the absolute value can be dramatically different for me, for you, and for another one. And that is not necessarily linked, I would say, even to our health or performance or anything like that. There's a very strong genetic component. And of course, our behavior is part of it. But at the same time, there is a very broad range of HRV values going from near zero to near 300. If we think about the main metric that is typically used, RMSSD, that you see, in Whoop, Oura rings, and all the wearables and most apps. So it's a very big range. And with our behavior, we can move it a bit from where we are, especially if maybe our sleep, our diet, our stress, or things that we do are not, well in check. For sure, we can improve things, but that change could be, 50% even of the value. But if your value is 20, then 50% of that, you get to 30. You don't get to 200 or 150, or the value that you might see in someone else data online or whatever. And so I think it's very important to understand that, because then a lot of people think that they should have certain values, and it might not be possible, and it also definitely not necessary, I would say, because it's not that those values are linked to necessarily to better outcomes or anything like that. So the way the data is useful is really in the context of relative changes in relation to your normal range and the stressors that you face. And a system that works well typically, bounces back to your normal quickly. And that means that if you measure every day through the night or in the morning, typically you want your data to be stable within your normal range, which does not mean that you're not experiencing stress. It simply means that you're able to get back to your normal within 24 hours, which is the window at which, the frequency at which you measure. And that is basically how typically we see a positive response. And there has been a lot of research recently also in looking specifically at this. So how much the data changes day to day, right? If it is more stable or not. It's a parameter we call the coefficient of variation, but it's just about stability. And there is quite strong evidence that shows that the more stable the data, typically, the better, the performance outcomes.
That makes total sense, actually. The first time I started using your app, I was very excited to see the data. And David actually said to me, no, hang on. I wouldn't pay. I think you said something like I wouldn't pay attention to the first 7 days, until you've first passed a certain amount of days. And I think you might have even said the first month, wait until 30 days, because it needs to learn what your baseline is. So that makes total sense. But I wanted to ask you, Vivian, something you said earlier was predicting illness, maybe. And that's something that I've seen in myself as well. But do you have an example of, like, sometimes I've gotten sick and then I've got back and looked at my HRV and I could see it getting lower and lower over multiple days, but I hadn't paid attention to it. And actually, it was a predictor that something maybe wasn't normal in my body. Is that something you hear all the time, or do you have an example that you can share with us where people have shared
Yeah,
that
so
with
I
you?
think I definitely heard that a lot. I think the two things. One is that HRV is a marker of our stress response, and that means that any stressor impacts HRV. That makes it sensitive and useful overall, but also not specific of anything. So if HRV is low and then later you get sick, and then you realize, hey, maybe something was already happening. And also the other aspect is, obviously the body is already fighting an infection, something is happening, you just have not developed other symptoms that make you realize that, right? So I think there is nothing predictive, it's always more of a detection. It has already happened, it's just that sometimes we haven't noticed yet because maybe, we are not having, a running nose or anything yet, but the body is already working harder, and then, your heart rate is a bit elevated, your sympathetic nervous system is more active, and things like that are captured by the data. So in a way it can be useful, but also at the same time, if we don't develop other symptoms, and HRV is not specific of sickness but is sensitive to all stressors, it's also difficult sometimes to behave differently, right? You Because later you see, okay, hey, it was already low, maybe I should have done something differently, but at the same time, maybe it was nothing, maybe it was dinner. You just had a heavy dinner and your data was also suppressed. So it's difficult because it's not specific, so you just capture overall stress and your response. And I think in a way there is something generic that we can do. So it's not maybe about sickness or about training. Also in the context of training, we can say the same things, because people think, okay, I use HRV because now I'm really dedicated to training this month or in the future. So I want to use HRV to make the most of my training. And then their lifestyle still goes sideways, every 2 days. And then the data will just reflect the lifestyle. It will have nothing to do with training. So we need to remember that if we use these tools, they are a novel marker of stress. So we need to have an approach where we consider all the factors, the context, and the context. Training is part of the context, but there is also sleep, there is also our diet, and everything that we do. So when we look at all of these things together, then HRV gives us a useful marker of our response. And in a way, even in this context in which we don't know maybe what might be driving the suppression, right? So in your case, you said, okay, I had the data a bit low, and later you realized you were sick. But before, I think still there is things we can do to manage stress differently those days. And I think that also links back to what we call HRV guided training. But training is just a simple application because the stressor can be modified very easily, right? So that's why HRV is used a lot in sports context. It's just that because if I'm very stressed at work or something is wrong with my health or in my family, I cannot just switch it and say, okay, today this stressor is not there. That will be with me chronically. But then if I have a hard training session today, then that I can really change. I can say, okay, I don't do it. I take it easy. So from that point of view, we can use HRV to make adjustments. That could be we reduce other stressors. So in your example, your rate is a bit low, maybe you're still not feeling it, but still, if you want to be cautious, okay, we just reduce the stressor where we have control, for example, training. And then we try to give priority to ways to recover, right? Maybe we sleep a bit more, we take a nap if we can, we pay more attention to our diet today. So we do all of these things that either reduce stress or try to give priority to recovery. And these are basically the two factors we can play with, right? So we can always do that even when we don't understand exactly what is the source of the suppression in HRV, basically what is causing the body not to be able to bounce back to our normal today. And of course, if we can understand what is the source, then it's easier. Maybe we play with that stressor specifically. But if we don't, I think we can still have a broad approach to health and performance that allow us to use the data in a useful way.
Yeah, I think so. Double clicking there. All stress is stress, right? Some of it's from spouse, some of it's from job, some of it's from diet, some of it's
Why'd
from
you, why'd you
sleep.
say spouse first? That came very quickly. Eh? That's like number one on the list.
Well, I'm thinking about a sick spouse, mate. What are you thinking about?
Oh, I'm thinking what everyone else is thinking.
Well, that's not my fault, mate. You guys are the problem, not me. Um, no, so things like relationships, work, food, temperature. Like, I mean, there's a seasonal aspect to HRV as well, for certain. You'll see seasonal variation in like normal baselines as well. And please correct me if I'm wrong, Marco. But all those things are stress, and they'll all be reflected on HRV. And so the key here is the reason HRV guided training works, or is suggested, or like the theory behind it is that it is about applying stress when you're ready to adapt to that stress, because the goal is not to do the most training, the goal is to adapt to the most training. And so really what we're trying to do here is you are ready or not ready to absorb training today, hard training. Is that fair to say, Marco?
Yeah, that's right. And I think when you look at the results of this study, it's always really fascinating to me how the group that did not do the hard training at the end of 2 months with less hard training, they perform better. Like, it goes against everyone would do as an athlete, because you always think that the hard training is leading to the gains, but then you need to do that when your body can absorb and simulate the stimulus, and that is not every day. I think intuitively we know that. Like, we know that there are not every day we respond to the training the same way. Some days we are tired, or we are sore, or we have any other fatigue, but then it's very difficult to embrace this approach in which you would train less hard, but then eventually perform better. And the studies where you don't perform better, I mean, there isn't a single study where you perform worse. So still, the outcome would be the same. So there's really nothing to lose, it seems, when you slow down a little sometimes, when your body is not ready to assimilate the stressor. I think that is a good way to use the data. I want to say also something else linked to the seasonality you mentioned, since we talked about what's a good
Yep.
HRV, and the issue in a way of aiming higher, or using that. If we reframe that, a lot of people I see using HRV as an outcome measure, not as something that, as we suggested so far, you use it as a feedback loop, right? So you look at the data and you want to make small adjustments so that what you improve in the long run is health and performance, is not HRV itself. And I think seasonality makes a strong case for this use against trying just to get your using HRV as an outcome. Because, for example, if we know there is quite a strong seasonality, especially for people that experience strong seasonality, right? So if you have very different seasons in your year, right? There's long days in summer and very short and dark days in winter, cold and hot differences and things like that. Your physiology reflects that. So your heart rate tends to be a bit lower in summer, a bit higher in winter, and your HRV the other way around. So if now it's November and I start some very good healthy habit related to my diet or my sleep or whatever, and I think that I'm doing this, so my HRV must increase. Otherwise, what I'm doing is useless. But then again, I'm going towards winter, and my HRV best case scenario stays where it is. Most likely, it will decrease. So if we think that way, HRV is the outcome, then we throw the good habits out of the window. But in fact, those habits will still be good for our health long term, and HRV is simply not a good proxy of our health, and we should not use it that way. So I think it's important also to think about these aspects. If we look at this data, it's really more about the feedback loop in the short term, the stress response, trying to make small adjustments. It's not about using it as this, North Star that you need to reach certain values or things like that.
I think that's really good advice. The outcome measure feedback versus feedback loop. Are there? I mean, I had a couple other questions here, some of which you kind of, I guess, ticked off. But are there any other misconceptions around HRV that you wanted to dispel?
So I would say that the two main ones are definitely the higher is better sort of thing. And I will add something here, another example, just to keep making a case for this. There are clinical conditions in which you have higher HRV than people that don't have such conditions. For example, if you even let's say in the context of caloric restriction, let's start there. If we do a bit of that, typically we have a reduction in heart rate and increase in HRV. That is, I think, mostly metabolically driven. So if we don't eat, the body tries to conserve energy. It does that also by slowing down. And parasympathetic system, maybe it's more active and heart rate is reduced and so on. We can push that to the very extreme, so get into cases of anorexia, anorexia nervosa. So we get into a clinical condition, and when we are there, HRV is higher than it is for people that don't have that clinical condition. And I think it's fairly obvious that that is not a good place to be for our health. So again, higher is not better, right? There needs to be the right context around it. And if we wanted to maximize our HRV, it is likely that the best option is to starve ourselves. But then that is again unlikely to be a good move for our health, right? So I think it's important there, again, to look where you are with your values. It doesn't mean it cannot change. Maybe in what still we can consider a positive ways is slowly trends a bit higher over the years, but that should be driven by, again, a healthy lifestyle. It will be still bounded by your genetics, and then the way you use the data is really more about the stability of it all more than on the higher values. So I would say this is one of the main misconceptions still. Similar to HRV is useful for this application or not that application, or this sport not that sport. I think that is also a bit of a misconception if we consider the broader aspect of stress and life and everything that impacts it. It's not that if you're an endurance athlete, this is going to be this super useful marker, and if you do strength training, it's not. Because even in an endurance athlete that is high level, that is training a lot and so on, then if they're doing things well, typically the data is really stable. And what you see is when things outside of training go sideways, and that is happening for everyone, because again, we all experience stressors that are not training related. And if we don't cope well with that, that's when the data typically is useful. So there also, I think that in general, we really need to have a bit more of a broader approach, not think of HRV only as something linked to your specific sport or to training in general. Yeah, what else? Well, the continuous HRV also we said. So I think again, this data
Yep.
really needs to be captured in a certain context, because otherwise it's not that measuring HRV equals measuring stress. So it is often sold this way, but it's not like that. The relationship breaks easily if we do not measure HRV under certain conditions, and those are the conditions that we discussed. If we look at other moments, it might not be relevant in the context of our stress response. And also, again, it is normal to experience stressors. Another example in this, linked to the issue of continuous HRV and the basically decoupling between HRV and the parasympathetic nervous system, which is what we try to capture, the response of the nervous system that is more linked to the body's ability to renormalize again and restore homeostasis and basically recover. If we are eating and then we digest, digestion is driven by the parasympathetic nervous system, but this impact is not reflected in cardiac vagal activity. So in the way the parasympathetic nervous system takes care of digestion is not reflected in heart rate variability. So parasympathetic activity after eating is higher, because again, digestion is driven by the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system. But if you measure HRV after eating, it will be suppressed. And that again, more of a metabolic response. Heart rate is higher because basically that's energy expenditure that your body is expending because of digestion. Is diet-induced thermogenesis. It's something else that metabolically drives the higher heart rate, and as a consequence, the suppressed HRV, even though parasympathetic activity is higher. So again, outside of known contexts, HRV does not equal parasympathetic activity or the activity of our recovery system, so to speak, but that relationship is not there anymore. So that's why we need, again, good protocols.
Yeah. Another one that comes to mind is on a high HRV day, I should be going harder. So we already talked about normal ranges. So I think that sort of dispels that, but it certainly isn't like I'm in normal range to do normal training. I'm above normal range, so I should go harder, and I'm below normal range, so I should go easier. It's kind of I'm either in normal range or outside of it. And if I'm outside of it, I should consider potentially why and probably not do the intensity that day.
Yeah. So I will add one
Is
thing
there,
because you remind me that it's what you mentioned is actually how many people approach HRV and use HRV, and so maybe we need to reiterate that really HRV is about adjusting your plan. It's not about making up your plan. So you need to have a plan. You need to have hard days, easy days, and those you will adjust a bit based on your physiological response. Because even if your HRV is normal, you cannot just go hard every day, right? That is a recipe for long-term disaster. So it's important that we have a plan and then we adjust the plan with HRV, and that is really the use case for this technology.
yeah. And then with respect to HRV guided training, we've sort of touched on it a little bit already, and I sort of alluded to it then, which is in effect, what ends up happening is that HRV acts as a throttle, which is you can't go hard today. There are no days it tells you to go hard, and generally, easy training, if we call that below first threshold, doesn't necessarily create the same stress as high intensity training. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's right. So all the studies that looked into this showed that if you keep the intensity low, basically there is no disruption from an autonomic nervous system point of view, and things renormalized really in a matter of minutes after the session. While if you do in an intensity that is higher than that, so a moderate workout or a hard workout, then that will leave an impact. Some studies also showed that the duration almost doesn't matter. I mean, obviously there's a limit to everything, but doing an hour on the bike or 2 hours on the bike below the first threshold, in both cases, you would not see a disruption in autonomic nervous system activity. So again, if the data shows that there is a suppression, then based on your habits, your capacity, obviously it is different for everyone, but still it does not mean don't do anything, don't train. It's just a matter of modulating intensity. So you might even still do a long ride or a long run if that's something you can keep at a low intensity. It is unlikely that you will make things worse from an autonomic nervous system point of view.
Yeah. And then anecdotally, I'd say that if you love training, it actually might be a beneficial thing. You
Yes.
might end up bouncing back a little bit better from it because it's, relaxation. I've always found, and I always said to you, Marco, you've seen a lot of my HRV data anecdotally and on the back end. I'm much more impacted by work than I am from training in general. And so generally training is restorative to me, even some of the harder stuff. So yeah, there is what it is. You just alluded to post-workout HRV there, which is normal renormalization. Do you think this is something that, I mean, obviously it's an imposition, and most people have kind of got to get their training done and get to work, right? And one of the things I like about you is, despite the way you've built your app, you're very practical for people, right? If you can only do overnight, do overnight. It's better than inconsistent in the morning. In the morning, get up, toilet if you need to, sit down, measure it for a minute. That's what we need, right? So very practically based. And post workout HRV is something that interests me, but I can't see myself sitting down to do it because you've got to control things. You can't drink. You got to do all this stuff. Do you think there's a context where it's useful in elite athletes, or do you think it's probably just too unusable?
Yeah, I would say the latter. I came back to this many times over the years, and I think it's just too impractical because of all the things that we mentioned that are impossible to control during the day in terms of continuous measurements. And then that makes it really hard. So for context here, we are talking about you measure before the training, you do the training, and you measure right after the training. And that's what the studies have done to determine what is the impact on the autonomic nervous system, because then you isolate training and you have a very specific protocol before and after. But then after the training, you cannot eat, you cannot drink, you cannot move, you cannot talk, you cannot shower. You just have to sit there 4 hours so that you can see this nice curve of your physiology renormalizing depending on the intensity of the workout. I mean, who can do that? And then also we need to keep in mind that when you have exercised, then the impact of your breathing that is changing enormously at that point, minute by minute, as you renormalize, the way you breathe from the exercise to resting values, also has a large impact on the HRV that is measured. So there is an extra confounder that at rest under conditions of regular breathing and normal breathing is not really there. But then I found it very difficult also with the consistency of the breathing, apart from the fact that you want to have at least a glass of water maybe, or you have other things to do. And even if most of the change happens in the first 5 minutes. So you could say, okay, let's just measure once 5 minutes after the workout to see if we are where we were before, and we stop it there instead of waiting for longer to see the older normalization if we did other training and so on. But even in that case, I think it is extremely difficult to keep this consistent in a way that it is useful. Sometimes for some people it might be possible, but normally, if with my best efforts I fail to collect good data apart from a few occasions, then I think that practically speaking, we have strong limitations here outside of laboratory settings. And as such, yeah, at the moment, it's not something I would really recommend.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. If you got to sit still, I didn't realize. I thought it was like a couple of minutes. I didn't even realize how extensive you had to wait. So yeah, that
Yeah,
makes
yeah. I mean,
zero
you
sense
cannot
to me
really do
to try and
anything
do.
talking, and again, how many times do we swallow saliva in a day? Like, there are papers looking at this, it's like millions. And every time you do that, your HRV doubles, right? So if it is 40 milliseconds, I do that once or twice
Wow.
in a minute, and then it's 80 milliseconds. So what are we looking at, right? So I think that's why these kind of measures, outside of a very specific protocol, there are so many things that impact variability without impacting your stress. Because otherwise, if you want to get stress relieved, just do that continuously and see if it does make you feel better. But I doubt that's how it works, just because the HRV is higher.
Yeah, no, that's. I think that's a great way. Post workout HRV is a great way to finish the podcast, Marco. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you spending some time with us, teaching us all about HRV. We have links to everything in the show notes. We have a link to HRV for training. Have a link to your Substack. Have a link to. I mean, we can link to anything else you want. People can find you on Strava though. We've got a link to your Instagram as well, and your ResearchGate. So we have links to all of that in the show notes. Marco's not hard to find. You can Google him; it'll show up. I did so.
I
Uh,
I searched for your podcast appearances in preparation for this, and it was tough choosing which one to listen to because there's a gazillion came up. You're a very popular man.
Thank you, guys. Too kind.
Well, there we go. That was Marco Altini, your mate. And when you say mate, you actually meet up for weekends in places like Barcelona and go for dinners in Amsterdam, etc. And you've been teasing him for a long, long time on this podcast. Great to finally meet him.
yeah, he actually listens to the podcast a bit from time to time. So yeah, it's cool to have him on. I'm sure he was anxiously, knowing Marco, was anxiously awaiting what we were going to say as the little bit at the end of the intro.
I could see
So
that. I could actually see that. That's when you know people are listeners.
yeah, he was worried. I'm not sure how happy he was about all the things said there, but that's okay. He's a good sport, Marco. But yeah, really good interview. I think there's a lot there for people. In typical Marco fashion, very honest. Almost, I wouldn't say to a fault, but to a way that maybe doesn't necessarily always advantage him from his apps point of view. But very cool. So, what did you take from it, mate? What were your learnings that were interesting for you?
Now, I wanted to ask you, what do you mean? What did you just say there by not honest to a way that might not advantage him? What do you mean?
I've said honest to a way that may not necessarily advantage him. He's very honest about it. He's very diplomatic. He's very honest. Like he won't, if it looks, if it's scientifically true and doesn't necessarily help him sell apps or may hinder him selling apps a little bit, he doesn't care. He'll happily say the scientifically honest thing. That's what I'm saying about him, which is
Okay,
why he's so
okay,
popular, is because he's not putting the hard sell on people. He's not trying to overmarket what he's doing. He's very scientifically authentic and honest, right? Like post workout HRV, he's got tools that allow you to measure that. He's like, yeah, it doesn't look like it's helping that much, right? It's too
yeah.
noisy. So, Mar-
No, but
Marco
to
also
answer
has a
you,
bunch of. So you go, mate.
carry on. No, carry on.
I was going to say he does a bunch of self experimentation too, which you can read about on his blog or on his Substack. And we didn't talk to him about some of the nutrition stuff. We may get him back on to talk about that at a different time. He's done some really interesting dietary manipulation stuff that, yeah, it was quite interesting. But sorry, mate, you were going to say something to
No,
answer
I
my
was just
question.
going to answer your initial question. What I found interesting was the collection of data over a period of time before paying attention to the tracking once you start using the app. That makes sense to get a baseline for the technology to start understanding you as a person. So, you as an individual, I really, really like that. That always tells me if a certain technology is taking the person in front of them into consideration versus just one thing to all things, or let's just use the averages of the population. I mean, the other thing I found interesting was I've just gone blank now. It was the oh yeah, not paying too not paying too much attention to a high HRV as well, being like, oh, my HRV is high, which means I can just go hard every day now, or my HRV is even higher. That's good. That is something I never took into consideration before. So that was interesting to hear.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I asked. I really use that religiously. I talk to him all the time. I text him about papers, so like I know the answers. So I know how to needle him as well. You could see his face when I asked some of these questions because he knew what I was. He knew I was either poking the bear a little bit or setting him up to answer a question that I thought was important. So yeah, I think for people, consistency is key. If that's an overnight measurement with your wearable, great. If it's morning measurement, great. If it's morning, get up, go to the toilet, sit down, take the measurement. If you can avoid the toilet because you don't need it, then fine, take the measurement. From there, you crank down intensity only. You don't crank it up, is worthwhile noting. I think there's a feed forward or a planning aspect to this as well, which is, I find that on Tuesdays, I'm never ready to absorb training because Mondays are very stressful for me. There are two solutions there. One is you never train hard on a Tuesday, so you shift that hard training day to a different day, right? Or you try and make Monday easier for you, right? And remove some of those stresses, whatever they are, if you can shift them around a little bit. So I think there's certainly a forward planning thing that you could do when you review data in looking back at things and look for consistent patterns. I would certainly do that and think about that as well with your data. There's not a lot of role for post workout HRV, but I mean the stuff in this area, the HRV guided training stuff, is fascinating. As Marco said, I've certainly seen a good 4 to 5 studies on it, and to every single one of them shows the same thing, which is you're no worse, you're probably better. For most of them, it actually shows better being guided by HRV, and that everybody in those studies does less intensity. And therefore, if we think about load as more than just the number of kilometers cycled or run, and we think about it in 2 dimensions, and we think about the intensity of those, or if we say it's the duration, it's not just duration, it's duration and intensity. If we think about it in more than one dimension, they do less total, right? They might do the same amount of duration, but not the same intensity. And if that's the case, your training load is less, and they still get the same benefits, if not better. So it's something to be said there about, again, it's about absorbing the training, not necessarily doing it. And you don't want to dig yourself a hole there.
It's a very cool app, and David and I might sound like we have shares in this app the way we promote it, but I would highly recommend people check it out. HRV for training. I've used it for a number of years now, and it is just such a cool tool, especially if you're in like big training blocks, big life stress moments, etc. Just helps you, as you said, adjust those days and make informed decisions. Thanks so much for
I would
getting
also
Marco on.
say, oh, you're welcome, mate. I would say that I know some of the people that use that app who've reached out to Marco. The good chance your favorite athlete does. Let's just say that. Despite anything else, there's a good chance your favorite athlete uses his app. So it's usually a good insight. But you're welcome, mate. I just wanted to say to people, we've got a little run here. This is the first of 3 interviews coming up that are interview only episodes coming up over the holiday break. You need some time off, and we'll talk a bit more about plans coming up, or we've already talked about that on the podcast. We just haven't recorded that yet. But thank you to the listeners for listening. We hope you enjoyed this one. There's some more coming, some great ones coming up, one on AI, one with Mario Fraioli as well. So do subscribe to the podcast if you haven't. That really does help us. So thank you to those who haven't. Please, if you haven't, please do that. Similarly, share the podcast. Share this with people who need to learn about HRV in general, who want to hear podcasts. And then, of course, engage with us on social. And join the Strava Club and all that stuff. That's Spotify, anywhere you want. We're on YouTube, all of it.
As always, appreciate every single one of you. Thank you so much for downloading, streaming, listening. We appreciate you. We drop a new episode for you every single Friday. Thank you very much. David, we'll catch you on the next one.
See you later, mate.